Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Michael Thompson. This week, the Federal Coalition fell apart in what appeared to be fairly spectacular fashion, with the Liberals and Nationals going their separate ways for only the third official time in their 80-year history. So we wanted to take a closer look at what drove Susan Lee and David Littleproud and their respective parties apart, and whether anything can bring them back together, or, considering the slightly rocky relationship between the two parties in the past, whether this whole thing could in fact be a storm in a teacup, so to speak. Tom Switzer is Executive Director at the Centre for Independent Studies. Tom, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Michael, great to be with you.
What do you reckon? You wrote a piece in the Financial Review which has really asked this question of whether they will be getting back together, and whether this is in the context of a fairly rocky history. It might just be another bump in the road.
Well, the conventional wisdom, Michael, is that this is a debacle for centre-right parties. And you mentioned it's very rare for the coalition agreement to be ripped up by one of the parties, and in this case it was the National Party. But anyone who's studied the history of the coalition going back a century would recognise that many times throughout that period, the centre-right Liberals, or the centre-right United Australia Party before that, and the centre-right Country Party, and then it became the National Party, they've all too often had serious clashes, both personal and ideological. And I think we should bear all that in mind before getting too worked up about the significance of this week's news. It's terrible news. I don't want to sugarcoat it. There are real policy differences which we can talk about. But anyone who has a sense of history should put this week's events in a broad historical context and recognise that both of these parties have an amazing ability to adapt and bounce back, and then form coalition and be serious contenders at future elections.
Before we get to the historical context, let's look at what drove it this week. There were a number of key policies that seemed to play a role, net zero, nuclear power being probably two of the biggest.
Yeah, well, look, I think what's happened with the Liberal Party this election is quite clear. They've really bled support in the metropolitan electorates, and I think all the available public polling evidence indicates that younger people and women, and a lot of people who do live in what used to be very safe Liberal seats, are very enthusiastic about decarbonising the Australian economy at a rapid rate. They're very pro-renewables. But of course, that attitude is at loggerheads with the rural regional Australia's constituency, which is more sceptical of reaching net zero targets, and also being more open-minded about alternative sources of non-carbon energy like nuclear. And that's really the clash on that issue, both net zero and nuclear. But they also clash on the issue of the extent to which government should break up supermarkets, insurance companies and whatnot. Peter Dutton took to the last election the National Party position on that issue, but that is very much at odds with the free market ethos of the centre-right Liberal Party, and that's where they clashed as well.
Okay. Was it a surprise to you then that it would drive a split? I mean, because they are fairly significant ideological differences there. But was it a surprise to you that they did actually split over this, and that there wasn't more time perhaps given by the Nationals for the Liberals to get their policy agenda in place?
Well, look, I went on ABC Regional New South Wales radio on this very subject late last week, and I didn't think that they would break up the coalition agreement. No, I was surprised. But having said that, I don't think it's the end of the coalition as we've known it. I think that both parties probably need a timeout anyway, just to get their own policy apparatus into gear and work out what they stand for. But, I mean, does anyone really think that when push turns to shove, and both of these parties, both the Liberals and the Nationals, if for argument's sake, and it seems unlikely for the foreseeable future, but if they manage to win enough seats to gain a parliamentary majority, do you think they wouldn't form government together? I think they would. I think that's pretty evident. And that's why I think ultimately all this is for show. There's a lot of turmoil, instability. Both parties will want to take a time out. But when the moment of truth arrives, my sense is that they'll unite and form a coalition in the lead up to the next election.
I want to get to that in a bit more detail in a moment, but it might be a good time actually to have a look at the fact that they have had these disagreements in the past. And obviously there were, I mentioned that there were 3 instances where there's been a major separation, but there's actually been a lot of minor issues, particularly say for the Howard years would be a good example. Bitter disagreements over gun policy, for instance.
Right. Well, you may recall in April 1996, we had the Port Arthur massacre.
Mhm.
And that prompted the then Howard government, the government of Prime Minister John Howard. And I think that government, by the way, had such a huge majority, won a huge majority against Paul Keating's Labor government in March of that year, that they probably could have governed in their own right. But he still kept the coalition with the Nationals. And of course, the Nationals represent regional, rural Australia. And so with the gun laws, that was popular in the metropolitan areas all across the country. But in many parts of regional Australia, there was a lot of angst. A lot of National Party voters did not believe that they should be punished for having guns that are primarily used to shoot wildlife and to do the relevant show games and sports games and whatnot. So you may recall Howard actually addressed a constituency of National Party voters, and he had security guard outfit. Do you remember that?
The bulletproof vest, wasn't it?
That's
And it
right.
was, yeah.
Extraordinary. And you could actually see there's a footage of him, I think it was around April, May 1996, when he's promoting the gun laws. And there's a wonderful photo of him speaking to a bunch of angry farmers, but you can actually see the vest back. And that just demonstrates my point, I think.
Yeah, and so the parties didn't split on that occasion. So there is capacity within the coalition for disagreement. Yet this time, for whatever reason, it did split.
Yeah, that gun laws is a good example, but they also disagreed profoundly on the question of Telstra. Now, Telstra used to be government-owned, like the Commonwealth Bank and Qantas, and in the course of the late 80s and throughout the 1990s, Labor governments under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, and then the coalition governments of John Howard and Peter Costello wanted to privatise a lot of these state entities. But Telstra was a very controversial issue because a lot of regional Australia felt that Telstra privatisation would threaten their services. And so there was a real break there between the National Party leadership of Tim Fischer and to a lesser extent John Anderson and John Howard and Peter Costello. And it became such a sensitive issue. And this, of course, is at the time when we saw the emergence of Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party that strongly opposed all aspects of so-called economic rationalism, competition policy, dairy market deregulation, privatisation, and so on and so forth. And the conservative wing of the National Party, essentially agrarian socialist, almost was siding with Pauline Hanson's One Nation. And to the extent that those attitudes were strong in the National Party, they were fundamentally incompatible with the Liberal Party ethos of John Howard and Peter Costello.
Tom, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to talk to you about what the Liberals need to do now in order to start appealing to some of those demographics that did abandon them at the recent election, but also what it means for Labor as well. We'll be back in a moment. My guest this morning is Tom Switzer from the Centre for Independent Studies. Before the break, we were talking largely about some of those historical instances where the Liberals and the Nationals have disagreed. Looking to the future now, what do the Liberals need to do? You mentioned that this is essentially a timeout that both parties kind of needed in terms of the Libs and the Nats. What does Susan Lee, as the new leader of the party, need to do during this time in order to establish the policy agenda for the party, what the Liberals stand for, and how much of that is now going to be geared towards regaining the support of voters that they have lost?
I think there are probably two things from the Liberal Party's perspective, because, again, all the available evidence in these metropolitan areas, these erstwhile safe Liberal seats, you know, your Goldsteins, I know that's probably going to go back to the Liberals, but your Kooyongs in Melbourne, your Curtins in Perth, your Ryans in Brisbane, and in Sydney it's Warringah and Mackellar and Wentworth. The Liberals are not going to win back those seats by championing a so-called cultural war agenda. I don't think they need to distance themselves from things like an opposition to the voice to Parliament, but they don't need to be making that a big issue. I think they need to focus more on trying to win over younger people who have left the Liberal Party in droves. Women especially, professional women, are turning off the Liberal Party. And I think one of the best ways of doing that is championing a smaller government agenda, one that supports market economics and housing affordability. I think this is one of the big issues for younger people. They're being priced out of the housing market. And I think it's a great opportunity for the Liberals to support more supply, more construction, more development. That has its own costs as well, because there are a lot of constituencies in these Liberal areas that are creatures of habit that don't want development because they fear that leads to congestion and more noise. But the reality is only by having more supply will you have a chance of reducing the prices for housing, and that allows younger people to get into the market. Now, there are some young people in the Liberal Party who believe in that agenda. I think that has to be really their future if they want to win back a lot of those metropolitan electorates.
The Nats don't need to change, though, do they? In terms of, because they have clearly still got the support of their voters. And so really it is all on the Liberal Party at this point in order to evolve and to change. But if the Nats don't change it is hard to see how they do mesh together, though, as a future coalition.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, we started with net zero. That's a classic case in point. I mean, just say for argument's sake, the Liberals and the Nats are back in Parliament in the next 3 to 6 to 9 years, and they need to address this issue. They're at loggerheads on that question. My own sense, Michael, and this is a minority view, is that I do think that over time it will dawn on people, as it has Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, that net zero is just unaffordable and unrealistic, at least by 2050. I think there is an energy transition taking place, but unless you have the technological breakthroughs, it's going to be very difficult to reach those targets in such a relatively short period of time. So I think ultimately the Nationals will be vindicated on that. But the Liberals don't want to be talking that language now because they'll alienate those people in those metropolitan electorates who are still very passionate about a renewables-only policy. So that's a real dilemma for the Liberal Party. It's not a problem for the National Party. And I should stress, the Nationals aren't doing too badly electorally. They had a decent election in 2022 when Scott Morrison lost power to Anthony Albanese. And this year, I think they lost one seat. I might be wrong about that. The Liberals, on the other hand, really went backwards, especially in those metropolitan areas. So it's the Liberals who are in trouble. And from David Littleprow's perspective, you can't blame the bloke. He doesn't want to be hand-fisted and have his hands tied behind his back by Liberal Party policy. He's got to represent his constituencies. And those two issues, nuclear and net zero, are great issues on which to deviate himself. But it'll also allow Susan Lee to adopt a more progressive, centrist position that appeals to metropolitan electorates.
Now, just quickly, because we are out of time, but is the big winner out of all of this Labor and Anthony Albanese, particularly when you've got such a small opposition party now in the Liberals, and really a situation where we might end up having the crossbenchers in terms of the Teals, the Nationals, one Greens MP will actually make up a larger percentage of Parliament than the actual opposition, the Liberals.
Yeah. Look, I think what you're putting to me is the conventional wisdom. But as a student of history, I'd just be wary of making grand proclamations so soon after an election. You have to remember circumstances in politics can change very quickly and without warning. One of my favourite quotes is Harold Macmillan, the British Prime Minister in the mid to late 50s, early 60s. And he said, events, dear boy, events. And that's how he described the unforeseeable triumphs and disasters that alter party political fortunes. I think there's a lot to be said for that. Remember, in December 2019, Boris Johnson won a massive landslide election and smashed Labor's red wall constituencies, working class constituencies in Northern England and the Midlands. And the overwhelming conventional wisdom in Westminster was that Boris Johnson and the Tories would have 2, maybe 3 more terms in government. Well, within a term and 3 Tory prime ministers later, the Tories were wiped out by the Labor Party.
That's right.
Richard Nixon in 1972 won 61% of the vote. He won 49 out of 50 states in the US presidential election. And yet within 18 months, he was turfed out of power and disgrace. And the Democrats, a little-known peanut farmer from Georgia, won the 1976 election. I'll give you one more example in the Australian context. John Howard won a thumping victory over Mark Latham and the Labor Party in October 2004. I was working at the Australian. The conventional wisdom in the media was that Labor would have to spend 2 more terms in opposition. But guess what? A nerd from Nambour who dined on his own earwax, Kevin Rudd.
Along came Kevin 07.
So circumstances can change quickly, Michael.
Yep. You never know what's just around the corner. Tom, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
My pleasure, Michael.
That was Tom Switzer, Executive Director at the Centre for Independent Studies. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Michael Thompson. Enjoy your day.